How are the molecules of different fluorescent colors different?
So once again, it comes down to the conjugation. So I can either have a little bit or a lot. And then there's other things called chromophores. So mostly in organic chemistry, it has to do with carbon, and the backbone has to be carbons bonded to themselves. So when I talk about conjugation, it's carbon doubly bonded to itself in a row. That's the base conjugation. But then if I add an oxygen or a nitrogen to it, it's called a chromophore because it interacts with the carbon and causes a different effect. So just in different combinations, and the idea is ultraviolet light is kind of a narrow range inside of our visible spectrum, but inside of our visible spectrum, that's quite wide. So we go from red to purple and all the colors in between. Every one of those have a specific amount, a specific wavelength and a specific amount of energy. So by changing the structure of the molecule, we can control how much energy the ultraviolet light loses. So ultraviolet light is high energy. That's why it can give you a sunburn and it's really bad for you. We take the ultraviolet light that's high energy and then we reduce the amount of energy that that light has, and then it gets back into the visible spectrum. So I can control how much energy it loses by controlling the molecule that's doing the absorbing. And there's actually, fluorescence is another huge idea in biotechnology, that they attach fluorescent molecules onto DNA and proteins so that they're easy to see. And there's literally a whole company that I visited one time. That's all they do is make fluorescent molecules and make variations to try to be able to change the wavelength to give variation inside of the molecules. So it's actually a huge business beyond paper and cloth, that it's part of the biotech. And that's what they do, is they try to combine different orders of carbon and oxygen and nitrogen to see what kind of wavelength they get out during fluorescence.
Carrie asks, is the amount of UV light required to make the fluorescent molecules react and visibly glow enough to cause UV damage?
So there's actually two different types of ultraviolet light. So they tend to group ultraviolet light all together. So ultraviolet means, so ultra means it's beyond the visible wavelength. So I think it gets to purple and then purple and then violet, and then you get to ultraviolet, which is beyond violet. We start getting into, light that you can't see in the visible spectrum. That's what they mean by ultraviolet. So in the ultraviolet region, for chemists, there's actually two different pieces. There's the ultraviolet you get just past the visible, and then there's some that's deeper. So there's actually two different types of ultraviolet light. One is relatively safe. I mean, you're not supposed to look at it in your eye for too long or things like that, but it won't really burn you. The other ultraviolet light is the stuff that will give you a sunburn. So what they do, if you've ever seen a tanning lotion, so material that's supposed to help you get a tan, it actually blocks out the bad ultraviolet and lets the good ultraviolet through. So you get the ultraviolet to develop a tan, but you don't get the ultraviolet to burn. So the black light and most of what's inside of ambient light, so inside artificial light, it barely gets past the visible spectrum. So you can sit under a fluorescent lamp bulb for 2 days and you're never going to get a sunburn. However, outside, you can tell, and this is part of why people think, they say ultraviolet light does, you can tell that it's not natural. Well, because it lacks that certain edge of the high energy ultraviolet that you have outside. So yeah, and that's the idea. So that when I use my black light, it's perfectly safe. So I didn't bring it, but at my lab, we use the high energy ultraviolet light, and some molecules, so some of the rock species that I have only glow under that particular type of light. And so we're able to put it out, but that stuff, it's dangerous. And one time I left it on, so it's a little lamp about this big. I left it on and I put it on a table and I was on there for about an hour. I didn't realize that I left it on. And then when I pulled it off, there was a big kind of block bleached out. It was bleached white from the ultraviolet, high energy ultraviolet light being sitting there. And that's kind of what happens if you've ever seen something, if you leave it outside in in daylight, it becomes bleached. And that's because of the high energy ultraviolet light is actually destroying the fluorescent molecules. So when you leave, like a piece of paper outside that has color printing on it, over time it will become completely white. And that's because the high energy ultraviolet light is going in and destroying the molecules that are inside of there, so it no longer has color.
So Jake, correct me if this is not your question, but he asks, if fluorescent material is easy to produce, why has it become a popular method to differentiate counterfeit bills and IDs?
Oh, so it's easy to produce, but the idea is it's hard to produce it in different colors. So like I could grab onto, like today, I could go grab onto a bunch of paper and grind it up and extract out the fluorescent molecules. But the idea is that to be able to get it in different colors is actually really hard. So when I looked at that counterfeit, the counterfeit ID, the picture itself was glowing blue. So it's very easy to get that blue color, but to get the brown and the flesh tones and it had it in green, that's very difficult. And also knowing the US Treasury Department, they probably have a unique molecule that does the glowing. So that glow is a very kind of warm green color that's actually very difficult to make in itself. So they probably have that locked down, and it's probably part of a trade secret, just like the paper and the ink that they put into the bills. They keep that under lock and key in terms of what's the exact combination. So that's, when I looked at that counterfeit ID, that's where they lost it, is they couldn't get that green color and they couldn't get the brown color. That's really hard to get. And so they just went with the blue. So the blue was easy to get. It's in a lot of different things, but the different colors are kind of hard to get. They're hard to process, and it's hard to print it out onto something and then cover it over with regular ink. So they're just making the overall printing process more difficult, more hoops to jump through. So I'm sure, so like they did have a fluorescent piece on that fake ID, but it wasn't complex enough.
Aaliyah is asking, why do glow sticks stop glowing or become dull over time? Is there an extra compound that stops them from glowing for a long period of time?
Yeah, so it's a chemical reaction. So it's like anything else. It's like gas inside of a car. Once I crack it, the reaction starts, but the reaction uses up molecules in order to do this. When it goes from the reactants to the products, and the products emit ultraviolet light, I'm using up the reactants. So over time, we use up the reactants, and after a while, the amount of reactants sort of go disappear. So it's like gas inside of a tank of a car. If I run the car long enough, eventually the gas will run out. So what's fun is you can actually affect the reaction, and this is something that you kind of do in a demo. If you crack a light stick and then if you put it in something cold, the reaction slows down, so the glow actually decreases. And then if you put it into boiling water, the reaction increases, and then the light stick starts glowing a lot more.
Marcus asks, why are things fluorescent?
So once again, it's with the inorganic stuff, like the rocks, I have to admit, I don't really understand that particular point so much. But it once again, it comes down to the structure of the organic molecules that are inside of there. And so this is what you get to learn. As an organic chemist, this is what I learned, is to be able to look at these structures of organic molecules and understand the underlying effect that they have, that I can look at it and look at the combination of carbons and nitrogens and say, oh, it's going to have this conjugation and it's going to have this glow. The other interesting part of organic chemistry is we have the ability to build things that, this is how a lot of these fluorescent molecules come from, is chemists build the molecules from very simple molecules. We add things together. So it's like building a castle out of Lego bricks. You kind of add the bricks on each other and build something complex. And because we're building it, it's very easy to substitute one thing for another. So if I'm building a castle out of, say, white Lego bricks, it would be very easy for me to put a red one or a blue one inside of there. So that's one of the things that we do as organic chemists, is we build these fluorescent molecules. And then as we're building them, we have the ability to variate them. And as you variate them, you start getting different effects.
Carrie is wondering, are things that are labeled neon colors, lights, etc., just fluorescent, or is there actually a different compound acting there?
So that's a very good question. So I have done extensive research on this, and neon means fluorescent. So it is called neon. It's just a term that they use that means it glows very brightly. So if you ever seen, they have like neon gummies, they actually fluoresce. They have a fluorescent compound inside of there. But the idea of the neon, when you look at them, they have that unusual brightness. And whenever you see that unusual brightness, 9 times out of 10 that they're fluorescent. And then the way that you check is you put it under a black eye. So yeah, neon like clothing and neon food, they've typically put some kind of fluorescent molecule inside of there. So they mean the same thing. And I think it gets to the idea that if you call something fluorescent, that doesn't sound nearly as appetizing as neon.
Why do things like absorb light or not absorb light?
Okay, it's part of the chemical structure. So when we, as an organic chemist, we are able to understand the structure of molecules. So literally when it comes through, oh, that's, I got it backwards. 1 second. There we go. That's what I decided. So it depends on the structure of the molecule. So the idea is we as chemists understand how the molecules put together. So carbons and nitrogens and hydrogens being bonded together. There's different ways that we can combine those things. And in those different combinations, they give different molecules property. So what we're looking for in this case is called conjugation. So there's a lot of carbon bonded to itself is called a double bond. And if you put a lot of those in the row, they tend to have an effect with ultraviolet light. So like quinine itself, the one that I showed you, had a lot of conjugation inside of there. If I don't have this conjugation where things are attached with multiple bonds to themselves, it doesn't glow. So, and you can kind of look, and it's actually, I'm writing about it. If you showed me a molecule, I could look at it and predict on whether or not it would glow under a black light or not, and be pretty correct most of the time.